They are coming. We must prepare for battle.
Welcome, listener. Have you ever wondered how a civilization of heroes, the very same who fought before the walls of Troy, could simply vanish? Not with a cataclysm from the heavens, nor with a single decisive invasion, but with a slow, quiet fading into twilight. The story we unravel today is not one of a sudden death, but of a long, painful suicide. It is the story of the Mycenaean Greeks, a people who built palaces that touched the sky, and then, with their own hands, tore them down. What strange sickness of the spirit can cause a mighty kingdom to consume itself from within? The answers lie not in grand battles, but in whispers of betrayal, the glint of bronze in a brother's back, and the slow, chilling silence that fell over the land. This is a mystery buried for 3,000 years. If you wish to follow the trail of clues into the heart of this ancient darkness, consider subscribing to our channel, Historical Truth, so you never miss a chapter of the past. The sun over the Argolid plain was a hammer of brass, beating down on the cyclopean walls of Mycenae. To the farmers tending the terraced olive groves below, the citadel was a world unto itself, a place of gods and kings. From his post at the Lion Gate, Captain Leander of the Royal Guard could see the lifeblood of the Wanax, the High King, flowing into the storerooms. Amphorae of wine and oil from the coast, sacks of grain from the Pylos plain, and ingots of precious copper from the east. The kingdom seemed as solid, as eternal, as the immense stones fitted together to form the gate he guarded. But Leander, a man whose beard was just beginning to be threaded with silver, felt a tremor in that solidity. It was not a thing he could point to, not a crack in the masonry. It was in the air itself, a tension that had settled over the Peloponnese in the last few years. The messages carried by swift runners between the great citadels, Mycenae, Pylos, Tyrans, Thebes, seemed more urgent, their contents more guarded. The laughter in the great Megaron during feasts had a sharper, more brittle edge. King Perseus, the Wanax, was growing old, and his son, the young Prince Theron, was hungry for the throne. Ambition, Leander knew, was a more dangerous weapon than any spear. His thoughts were interrupted by the approach of a dust-covered rider on a lathered horse. It was Lysias, a scout from the northern patrol. Leander waved him through the gate, following him into the relative cool of the citadel's lower courtyard. Lysias dismounted, his face grim. "Report," Leander said, handing him a skin of water. Lysias drank deeply, then wiped his mouth. "The same, Captain. Nothing and everything? The trade route from the north is thinner than last season. Fewer merchants, more armed bands watching from the high passes. They don't wear the colors of any kingdom we know. They're just men with swords, and the villages in the foothills." He trailed off, his eyes haunted. "What of them? Abandoned, not raided, not burned, just empty, as if the people simply walked away from their homes and fields. We found a pot of stew, cold and congealed, still sitting in the ashes of a hearth. No signs of a fight. It's unnatural." Leander felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. An enemy you could face, a plague you could flee. But silence, emptiness, that was a different kind of fear. This was not the work of the sea peoples the Egyptian scrolls spoke of, nor a Hittite army. This was a rot, a slow decay from within the very lands the Mycenaeans called their own. Later that evening, in the flickering torchlight of the great hall, he saw the other side of the sickness. King Perseus sat on his throne, his face a mask of regal authority, but his eyes were clouded with a deep weariness. To his right sat Prince Theron, handsome and fierce, his gaze constantly sweeping the room, assessing, judging. The lords of the other great houses were present, the Lord of Tyrans, a bullish man with a network of coastal spies, the representative from Pylos, a quiet, calculating recorder of tablets. They spoke of tariffs, of disputed grazing lands, of slights to honor. A lord from a western province stood. "Wanax," he began, his voice respectful but firm. "The men of Pylos graze their flocks on pastures my people have used for generations. They drive our shepherds away at spear point. I seek your justice." The representative from Pylos barely looked up. "The clay tablets in our archives show those lands were ceded to us 2 generations ago. Your people are the trespassers. The argument escalated, voices rising, hands hovering near dagger hilts. It was King Perseus who finally silenced them with a raised, trembling hand. Enough, he said, his voice a dry rustle. The land shall be divided, a third to the west, 2/3 to Pylos. A tense silence fell. The Western Lord's face was a thundercloud of suppressed rage. The Pylian allowed himself a small, cold smile. Leander watched Prince Theron, who said nothing, but watched his father's judgment with a look of profound contempt. The decision had solved nothing. It had only planted a seed of a future grievance. This was the strife Lysias's report had hinted at. The kingdom wasn't being attacked from without. It was unraveling, thread by thread, from the pettiness and pride of its own lords. The walls were still high, the storerooms still full, but the foundation, the unity that had made them great, was turning to dust. The division of the grazing lands festered like a wound left untended. In the weeks that followed, Leander saw the consequences ripple out from the great hall and into the very streets of the lower town. A merchant from Pylos was found beaten in an alley, his wares stolen. In retaliation, a shipment of fine Argive pottery destined for the Western Lord's estate was accidentally dropped from a cart, shattering into worthless fragments. The king's justice, once swift and feared, now seemed slow and uncertain, bogged down in a mire of competing claims and whispered threats. Leander found himself tasked with ever more delicate and distasteful missions. He was no longer just a captain of the guard, a protector of the realm. He had become a political instrument, sent to remind a restless vassal of his oaths, or to discreetly investigate the loyalties of a local governor whose tax shipments had grown curiously thin. It was on one such journey, riding south towards the coastal fortress of Tyrans with a small contingent of his most trusted men, that the abstract tensions of the court became a stark, physical reality. The road, usually busy with traders and messengers, was unnervingly quiet. The few travelers they did meet were furtive, their eyes downcast, hurrying on their way without the customary greetings. As they rounded a bend that overlooked a narrow valley, Leander reined in his horse. Below, a scene of recent violence was etched into the earth. A merchant caravan, a dozen carts in all, had been attacked. The carts were burnt-out husks. Their contents, bolts of cloth, sacks of grain, amphorae, looted or smashed and scattered. The air still carried the faint, sweet, sickly smell of death. "No scavengers," one of his men muttered, his hand on his sword. "Too fresh. Or they're still nearby." Leander dismounted, his boots crunching on broken pottery. He moved among the wreckage, his soldier's eye taking in the details. This was no random bandit raid. The attack had been brutal and efficient. The guards had been cut down in a defensive circle, their bodies stripped of armor and weapons. But it was the bodies of the merchants and their families that chilled him. They had not been simply killed, they had been massacred, the violence excessive, a message written in blood. "Captain?" Lysias called from the edge of the site. He was kneeling beside a body half hidden in the scrub. The man was dressed in the rough-spun tunic of a driver, but clutched in his rigid hand was a small, carved seal stone of a type used by the palace bureaucracy of Tyrans. He was a royal courier, traveling in disguise. Leander took the stone. It was smeared with dried blood. This changed everything. An attack on a merchant train was a crime. An attack on a royal messenger was an act of war or rebellion. Who had he been running from? Or to? As they prepared to bury the dead, a sound from the surrounding hills made them freeze, the distant metallic clang of a shield being struck. It was answered by another, then another, echoing around the valley. It was not an attack, but a declaration. "We are here. We are watching. This is our land now." They rode the rest of the way to Tyrans in a tense silence, the weight of the slaughtered courier heavy in Leander's pouch. The Lord of Tyrans, a bullish man named Creon, received the seal stone with a face of granite. His great hall, though, smaller than Mycenae's, was just as opulent, lined with bronze weapons and frescoes of octopuses and leaping dolphins. "This is the third such incident this season," Creon said, his voice a low rumble. He did not invite Leander to sit. "The hinterlands are becoming a nest of vipers, brigands, dispossessed farmers, former soldiers with no lord to serve." He tossed the seal stone onto a table. "Mycenae's grip is weakening, Captain. Your Wanax's judgment is questioned. Perhaps it is time we and Tyrans look to our own defenses more closely. The message was clear. The loyalty of the great citadels was conditional, a fraying rope. The attack on the caravan was not just the work of outlaws. It was a symptom of the kingdom's fracturing authority. As Leander left the oppressive hall, he looked out over the blue expanse of the Saronic Gulf. The sea, once a highway of commerce and connection, now seemed a vast empty moat, isolating each beleaguered citadel to face the gathering dark alone. The war for survival had already begun, and the first enemies were not at the gates, but within the very walls of the Mycenaean world itself. The return to Mycenae felt less like a homecoming, and more like stepping into a cage where the bars were slowly tightening. The air in the citadel was thick with a new, more potent strain of fear. Leander went straight to the royal archives, a small, windowless room deep within the palace, lit by a single clay oil lamp. The air smelled of dust and dried clay. Here, the kingdom's memory was stored not on parchment, but on hundreds of fired clay tablets, incised with the precise angular script of linear B. The archivist, an old, thin man named Philo, with eyes magnified by years of squinting at small marks, looked up nervously as Leander entered. "Captain, you seek something?" "The records from the north," Leander said, his voice low. "The grain shipments from the Thessalian plains, and the personnel rolls for the garrison at Thebes, the last 5 years." Philo's hands fluttered like startled birds. "The Theban rolls. Some of those are being reviewed by the prince's scribes." A cold certainty settled in Leander's gut. He leaned closer, the lamplight carving deep shadows into his face. "Philo, you served the king's father. You remember when the word of the Wanax was law from Crete to the Ionian coast. Look at me now and tell me what is happening." The old man's shoulders slumped. He shuffled to a shelf and brought back a single tablet, handing it to Leander with a trembling hand. It was a personnel list for the Theban garrison, but next to the names of several veteran officers were fresh, crude scratches, canceling them out. In the margin, written in a different, more aggressive hand, was a single word: Lake Demon, loyal to Sparta. "It is not just Thebes," Philo whispered, his voice barely audible. "Pylos suspects Tyrans of hoarding tin. The lords of the west whisper that the king in east, Mycenae, is too old to hold the alliances together. They look to younger, fiercer men." He didn't need to say Prince Theron's name. "The records, Captain, they are being rewritten. The past is being unmade to suit the future." Leander left the archives, the weight of the clay tablet in his hand feeling heavier than any sword. The conspiracy was no longer a matter of whispered arguments in the hall. It was being chiseled into the official memory of the kingdom itself. The unity of the Mycenaean world was a story they told themselves, and that story was falling apart. That night, a feast was held to celebrate the return of a trading galley from the east. The great megaron was loud with the sounds of lyres and boasting, the smoky air rich with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. King Perseus sat on his throne, a hollowed-out figure draped in gold, his smiles brittle. Prince Theron held court at the center of a group of younger, ambitious lords, their laughter too loud, their gestures too broad. Leander watched from the shadows, a cup of untouched wine in his hand. He saw a lord from a minor eastern estate approach the prince, bowing low. He saw Theron clap the man on the shoulder, a gesture of royal favor, and hand him a golden cup. But Leander's eye, trained for detail, caught the flicker of movement afterwards. The lord, turning away, slipped the golden cup not into his own belt, but to a hulking, silent man standing behind him, a man whose face was scarred and who wore the distinct wolf-pelt cloak of a northern hill chieftain. A man who should not have been within a mile of the Lion Gate. It was a payment, a bribe, not for loyalty, but for something else, for service rendered or service yet to come. The northern hills were where the villages were being emptied. The pieces, disparate and sinister, were beginning to click into a horrifying picture. The enemy was not at the gate. He was in the hall, drinking the king's wine, and he was systematically dismantling the kingdom, not for conquest, but for the chaos that would allow him to seize a hollowed-out throne. The survival war was not against an external foe, but a civil war engineered from the top, a self-destruction so profound it would leave nothing for the victor to rule but ruins and ghosts. The feast cacophony faded into a dull roar in Leander's ears. the laughter now sounding like the shrieks of gulls over a shipwreck. He watched the northern chieftain melt back into the crowd. The golden cup vanished into his wolf pelt. The transaction, swift and silent in the heart of the king's own hall, was a more profound betrayal than any battlefield defeat. This was a calculated corrosion of the realm's very foundation. Prince Theron wasn't just preparing for a succession, he was actively scouring the land clean of his father's support, using fear and banditry as his tools. The empty villages Lysias had described were not a mystery anymore. They were a strategy. Leander knew he could not go to the king. Perseus was a flickering lamp, his authority guttering out. To voice such an accusation against the crown prince would be his own death warrant, branded a sower of discord. He was alone, a single stone in a wall that was being taken apart, stone by stone, from the inside. He needed proof, something more tangible than a glimpse of a golden cup changing hands in a smoky hall. He found Lysias at the guard's barracks, sharpening his spearhead with a steady rhythmic scrape of stone on bronze. Leander drew him aside, into the cool night air of the courtyard. The stars were sharp and cold overhead, indifferent to the petty conspiracies of men. "The northern chieftain you saw at the feast," Leander began, his voice low, "the one with the wolf pelt. I need to know who he is, and I need to know where he goes when he leaves Mycenae." Lysias's eyes gleamed in the starlight. He was a man of action, and the stagnant, poisonous atmosphere of the citadel had been chafing at him. "His name is Boros. He leads a clan from the highlands near Arcadia. They were never fully tamed, paid tribute in furs and a few men for the army, but lately they've grown bold. They say Boros has a new patron, one who pays in Mycenaean gold." Leander nodded. The pieces fit together with a sickening click. "Follow him. Don't be seen. I want to know his routes, his contacts. If he meets with anyone from the other citadels, Pylos, Tiryns, especially any of the prince's men." Days turned into a tense, watchful week. Life in the citadel carried on with an air of brittle normalcy. The scribes continued their work, the priests made sacrifices to the gods, and the blacksmith's hammers rang out, forging weapons for an enemy no one could clearly name. Yet, a strange paralysis had settled over the kingdom's leadership. Decisions were deferred, disputes left to fester. It was as if the entire complex machinery of the Mycenaean state was seizing up, its gears clogged with suspicion. Leander spent his time reviewing garrison reports and supply inventories, the dry lists of numbers now reading like a chronicle of decline. The figures for Thebes were particularly alarming. The garrison was at half strength, and the official tablet cited sickness and garrison rotation. But Philo, the archivist, had slipped him an older hidden tablet showing that the seasoned officers, the ones loyal to the old king, had been systematically reassigned to remote, worthless outposts, or had simply disappeared from the records altogether. When Lysias returned, he came under the cover of a moonless night, his face grim and smudged with dirt. He found Leander at his post by the lion gate. "Boros left 2 days ago," Lysias reported, his voice a husky whisper. "He did not take the northern road back to his hills. He went west, towards the coast. He met with a ship captain, a small, fast galley with a black sail, no markings. It did not look like any of our trade vessels. They exchanged words on the beach, and Boros was given a small, heavy chest before the ship rowed back out to sea. A black sail, a clandestine meeting on a deserted beach, a payment from the sea. This was bigger than Theron, far bigger. The prince's ambition was just one thread in a much darker tapestry. Mycenae was being assailed from all sides, by the calculated treachery of its own prince, by the restless ambition of its rival citadels, and now by a silent, unknown enemy from across the wine-dark sea. The survival war was a multi-front conflict, and the greatest battle was being fought not with swords and spears, but in the shadows, where loyalties were bought and sold, and the very soul of the civilization was being bartered away for chests of gold. The walls of Mycenae still stood, but the world beyond them was dissolving into a treacherous, formless dark. The news of the black-sailed ship was a cold stone in Leander's belly. It confirmed his deepest fear. The rot was not merely internal. The strife between the citadels, Theron's treacherous ambition, the banditry in the hills, these were not isolated calamities. They were symptoms of a wider sickness, a systemic failure that was being exploited by a cold external intelligence. Someone, from across the sea, was pouring poison into the already festering wounds of the Mycenaean world. He could not remain passive, waiting for the next report, the next empty village, the next assassinated courier, was a recipe for oblivion. He needed to look this new enemy in the face, or at least trace its shadow. He made a decision that bordered on treason itself. He would not seek the king's permission, for that would alert the prince. He would use his own authority and a handful of men whose loyalty was to the idea of Mycenae itself, not to the flawed men who currently ruled it. Under the pretext of a routine patrol to reinforce the coastal watchtowers south of Tiryns, Leander, Lysias, and 5 carefully chosen veterans left Mycenae. Their true destination was the stretch of coast where Lysias had seen Boros meet the mysterious galley. They rode for 2 days, the landscape growing more rugged and deserted. The great villas that had once dominated the coastline here stood silent, their fields untended, their gates barred and reinforced. The world was closing in on itself. On the evening of the second day, they reached the place, a narrow, pebbled cove hidden between 2 high headlands. It was a smuggler's paradise, invisible from both land and sea until you were right upon it. They concealed themselves and their horses in a thicket of stunted pines atop the northern headland and settled in to watch. For a day and a night, they saw nothing but the endless hypnotic crash of the waves. Doubt began to gnaw at Leander. Had it been a one-time meeting? Had they missed their chance? Then, on the second evening, as the sun bled into the sea, sail appeared on the horizon. It was small, and as it drew nearer, they saw it was indeed black, a stark, malevolent slash against the twilight sky. The galley was sleek and low in the water, built for speed, not trade. It carried no visible insignia, and the oars dipped into the water with a quiet, practiced rhythm that spoke of a highly disciplined crew. It did not look like the ragged, desperate ships of the so-called sea peoples described in traders' tales. This was something else, something purposeful. The ship anchored just beyond the breakers, and a small boat was rowed to shore. 2 men disembarked. One was tall and lean, dressed in a simple dark tunic, his head bare. He carried an air of authority that was palpable even from a distance. The other was a hulking guard. They stood on the pebbles, waiting. An hour later, a party arrived from the landward side. It was not Boros this time. It was a man Leander recognized with a jolt of cold fury, a junior scribe from the palace at Pylos, a man who had often accompanied his master to Mycenae. He was nervous, clutching a sealed leather satchel to his chest. He approached the tall man from the ship and, with a deep bow, handed over the satchel. The tall man opened it, pulling out a sheaf of papyrus scrolls, a far lighter and more efficient medium than Mycenae's clay tablets. He scanned them by the last light of the day, then nodded, a curt, satisfied gesture. He handed a small, heavy bag to the scribe, who took it with trembling hands before scurrying back into the gathering darkness. Leander's mind raced. A scribe from Pylos. Papyrus scrolls. What could he be selling? Tax records, grain inventories, the deployment schedules of the Pylian fleet, or something even more precious? The secret clay tablet ciphers, the location of hidden harbors, the names of loyal lords in other kingdoms. This was espionage on a grand, horrifying scale. The enemy wasn't just funding bandits. They were buying the kingdom's secrets, its very soul, piece by piece from its own corrupted officials. The survival of Mycenae was no longer just a matter of arms. It was a race against a silent, information-eating shadow that was learning all of its weaknesses. The ride back to Mycenae was a grim, silent journey. The wind, which should have carried the scent of pine and sea salt, now felt heavy with the stench of betrayal. The papyrus scrolls exchanged on that lonely beach were more damaging than any army. They were the blueprint of the kingdom's demise. Leander knew he had to act, but the path forward was a labyrinth with a minotaur at every turn. To expose the Pylian scribe would be to accuse Pylos itself of treason, shattering the last pretense of the Mycenaean alliance and likely triggering the very war Theron seemed to be courting. To go to King Perseus was useless. To confront Theron was suicide. He decided on a risk that felt like desperation. He would bypass the crumbling structures of power entirely. He needed to find someone still loyal, not to a king or a prince, but to the land itself. He thought of a man named Idomeneus, the aging lord of a small but strategically vital coastal estate near Pylos. Idomeneus was a relic of a different age, a man who had fought alongside Perseus in his youth, and whose loyalty was as solid and unyielding as the bedrock of his headland. He was also far enough from the great palaces to perhaps have avoided the worst of the poison. Sending a message was too dangerous. Leander would have to go himself. He left Lysias in command at Mycenae with strict instructions to watch the prince and his northern ally, Boros. "If you sense any move against the king," Leander told him, his hand on the younger man's shoulder, "get him out. Use the old postern gate behind the granaries. Take him to the shrine of the Earth Mother. It's the only place Theron might hesitate to profane." Then, under the guise of inspecting the western watchtowers, a story that was becoming dangerously thin, Leander set out alone. He rode hard, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the high, lonely shepherd's tracks. The land he passed through was a portrait of accelerating decay. Fields that should have been green with young barley were choked with weeds. A once prosperous village was now a skeleton of blackened timbers, the story of its end untold. He saw no armies, no great hordes of invaders. The collapse was a quiet, insidious thing, a paralysis that started in the spirit before it reached the walls. After 3 days of hard riding, he reached the estate of Idomeneus. It was not a grand citadel, but a fortified manor house built on a promontory, its white walls gleaming in the sun. The guards at the gate were old, grizzled men, their armor worn but cared for. They recognized the crest of the Mycenaean royal guard and let him pass with a respectful nod, a gesture of fealty he had not seen in a long time. Idomeneus received him in a simple hall, adorned with well-used weapons and fishing nets. He was a stout man, with a broad, weathered face and eyes that held a deep, weary sadness. He listened in silence as Leander laid out the whole, sordid tapestry. Theron's ambition, the northern bandits, the black-sailed ship, and the traitorous scribe from Pylos. When Leander finished, the old lord sighed, a sound like the wind leaving a sail. "I have watched the smoke from the great halls grow dark with suspicion for years, Captain," Idomeneus said, his voice rough. "You speak of a sickness, and you are right. But the sickness is not just in the princes and the scribes. It is in the soil. The people have lost faith. They see their lord squabbling like dogs over a bone, while the world grows wild around them. Why should a man till a field if his harvest will be stolen by a noble bandit? Why should a man fight for a king who cannot keep the peace between his own sons?" He rose and walked to a window, looking out over the churning sea. "This enemy of yours, the one with the black sail, they are not the cause, they are the vultures, drawn by the scent of a dying beast. They know we are tearing ourselves apart. They need only wait and pick our bones clean." He turned back to Leander, his expression grim. "I am loyal to the memory of what Perseus was, and to the land my fathers held. I will send word to the few I still trust. We will watch the coasts, we will protect our own. But I cannot give you an army to march on Mycenae. The war you must fight, Captain, is not one that can be won with spears. It is a war for the soul of Achaea, and I fear that war is already lost." Leander left the next morning, the old lord's words echoing in his mind. Idomeneus had given him no army, no easy solution, but he had given him something perhaps more valuable, a stark, unvarnished truth. The final battle would not be at the gates of Mycenae. It would be in the hearts of its people, and in that arena, the forces of dissolution held every advantage. The return journey to Mycenae was a descent into a waking nightmare. The sickness Idomeneus had spoken of was no longer an abstract concept. It was a visible plague upon the land. Leander encountered a river, once a vital trade route, now choked with the bloated carcasses of sheep, their throats slit and left to rot in a deliberate act of sabotage. A main bridge, built of sturdy timber, had been burned, forcing a long, treacherous detour through bandit-haunted gorges. He passed a sanctuary to the Earth Mother, a place that should have been inviolate. The sacred statue had been defaced, its stone features smashed, and a fresh, unburied body, that of a priest by his robes, lay sprawled at the altar. The gods themselves were being driven from the land. When the high cyclopean walls of Mycenae finally came into view, they did not bring a sense of safety, but of dread. The citadel stood like a great brooding beast, wounded and dangerous. The activity around its base was frantic but disordered. Refugees from the emptied countryside huddled in makeshift camps, their wails of loss and hunger a constant low drone. The royal guards at the Lion Gate, men he had trained, looked at him with hollow eyes, their discipline frayed to a breaking point. He found Lysias not at the barracks, but in a small, dark storeroom near the armory, counting arrowheads by the light of a single lamp. The young scout's face was pale, a fresh, angry cut marring his cheek. "What happened?" Leander asked, his voice tight. Lysias looked up, his expression a mixture of relief and fury. "It started, Captain. 2 days ago. Boros and his hill wolves descended on a village just a half-day's march north. One we were supposed to be protecting. They didn't just raid it. They burned it to the ground, slaughtered every man and boy of fighting age, and took the women and grain." He gestured to the cut on his face. "I took a patrol out to intercept. We were ambushed, not by Boros's men, by a contingent of the Royal Guard." The air left Leander's lungs. "The Royal Guard?" "Prince Theron's personal contingent," Lysias spat. "They claimed we were interfering with a pacification action, that the village was harboring bandits. They fired on us, Captain. Mycenaean bronze against Mycenaean bronze. We lost 3 good men before we disengaged." He slammed a fist onto the crate of arrowheads, the metallic rattle loud in the confined space. "He's using the chaos he created to purge the kingdom of anyone loyal to the king. He calls it justice, but it's a culling." This was the next inevitable phase. The Shadow War was over. The open, fratricidal conflict had begun. Theron was no longer just undermining his father. He was actively hunting his supporters under the guise of restoring order. The survival war was now a civil war in all but name, a self-inflicted wound that was bleeding the kingdom to death. Leander knew his own time was short. If Theron's men were bold enough to attack a captain's patrol, then his own position as captain of the guard was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. He had to see the king, one last time. He found Perseus not in the great hall, but in his private chambers. The room was dark, the shutters closed. The old king sat slumped in a chair, staring at a fresco of a triumphant lion hunt from his youth. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. "My king," Leander said, kneeling. Perseus's eyes, clouded and distant, slowly focused on him. "Leander, you have returned. Do you bring me news of the harvest, the scribes? The scribes tell me the numbers are not good." His mind was retreating to a simpler past, unable to face the monstrous present. "The harvest has failed, my king," Leander said gently, the truth a cruel necessity. "Not from blight, but from the sword. Your son moves against you. His men attacked my patrol. He is carving out his own kingdom with the blood of your subjects." A flicker of the old king, the warrior, surfaced in Perseus's eyes. It was a brief, painful spark. "Theron is ambitious. He is young. He will learn." The spark died. "The alliances, they must be upheld. Send a message to Pylos. We must have a council." He was gone, lost in the fog of age and denial. There would be no rallying cry, no last stand ordered by the king. The throne of Mycenae was already empty. The only question that remained was who would be left to claim the ruins. As Leander left the chamber, the weight of his loyalty felt like a chain dragging him down into a grave that had been dug, not by invaders, but by the very family he had sworn to protect. The silence in the king's chamber was more deafening than the clash of arms outside. Leander closed the heavy door behind him, the finality of the sound echoing in the deserted corridor. The last thread of legitimate authority had just snapped. King Perseus was a phantom, and Prince Theron was the fevered dream that had consumed the body of the kingdom. There would be no order, no rallying point. Mycenae was now a ship with a madman at the helm, steering directly for the rocks. He moved through the palace like a shadow, his senses heightened to a razor's edge. Every corner could conceal an assassin sent by the prince. The whispers that had once been subtle were now open, defiant mutters. He saw clusters of Theron's men, their armor polished, their faces hard with a fanatical loyalty to the new, rising sun. They looked at him not as their captain, but as an obstacle, a relic to be swept aside. He found Lysias where he knew he would, at the small, hidden postern gate behind the granaries, the emergency escape route he had mentioned days before. The young scout had a pack of provisions and 2 water skins ready. His face was set in a mask of grim resolve. "It is time, Captain," Lysias said, his voice low and urgent. "The prince has ordered your arrest for inciting rebellion and dereliction of duty. His men are searching the barracks for you now. We have to get the king out." Leander nodded. There was no other path. To stay was to die, and his death would serve no one. Their duty now was not to a throne, but to a man, and to the fragile ember of memory they could carry with them into the darkness. "Is the route to the shrine clear?" "For now," Lysias said. "But we must move like ghosts." They returned to the king's chambers. Perseus offered no resistance as they draped a common, dark cloak over his royal robes. He seemed almost childlike in his confusion, allowing them to guide him from the room he had ruled from for decades. They slipped through the servants' passages, the air thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things. The sounds of the citadel, the shouts of Theron's men, the frantic bleating of sheep in the lower court, grew muffled, then faded away as they reached the granary. The postern gate was a small, low arch of stone, hidden by stacked amphorae. It led out onto a steep, rocky path that descended into a narrow gorge behind the citadel. As they pushed the king through and into the cool night air, a sense of profound loss washed over Leander. He was not just leaving a place, he was abandoning an era. The age of heroes was ending not with a thunderous crash, but with a furtive, shameful retreat. They moved quickly, half carrying the old king between them. The shrine of the Earth Mother was a simple cave nestled in the cliffs, a place of ancient power far older than the Mycenaean kings. It was sanctified, a place where even Theron might hesitate to spill blood. As they reached its dark mouth, Leander turned for one last look at Mycenae. The citadel was outlined against the night sky, its proud walls still imposing. But from within, he could see the new, chaotic light of many torches moving erratically and the red glow of a fresh fire blooming in the lower town. Theron was not just taking power, he was purging it. The celebration of his ascension was being written in the flames of his own capital. The self-destruction was complete. The great palace, the center of a world, was consuming itself in a final, fiery convulsion. They had escaped the blaze, but as Leander turned his back and led the broken king into the deeper darkness of the sacred cave, he knew they were now just refugees in a land that was ceasing to be. The war was over. The Dark Age had begun. The cave was cold, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and ancient incense. A single guttering oil lamp, tended by a lone ancient priestess with eyes like milky stones, cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. King Perseus sat on a rough-hewn stone bench, wrapped in his cloak, staring into nothingness. The journey had exhausted him, and the last vestiges of his mind had retreated to a safe, inaccessible harbor. He was now a living tomb, containing the memory of a lost world. Leander and Lysias took turns keeping watch at the cave's entrance, a narrow slit overlooking the gorge. The first night, the sky to the north, where Mycenae stood, glowed a sullen orange. By the second day, a column of thick black smoke rose like a twisted pillar to the heavens. They didn't speak of what it meant. The evidence was plain. Theron's seizure of power had not been clean. There had been resistance, or perhaps just the wanton violence that follows when ambition is unleashed from its chains. The very heart of the Mycenaean world was burning. On the third morning, Lysias, returning from a scouting trip further down the gorge, brought back more than just news. He brought a refugee, a potter from the lower town, his face blackened with soot, his tunic torn. The man fell to his knees before the silent, uncomprehending king, weeping. "The palace," the potter choked out, his body racked with sobs. "They fought, the guards loyal to the old king against the prince's men. They fought in the great hall, in the courtyards, brother against brother. They set the granaries on fire, the oil stores. Everything is burning. The prince, Theron, he stands on the walls and calls it a purification." The man looked up, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the immediate violence. "And the others?" Word came from the north. "While we were tearing ourselves apart, the men of Thebes and Orchomenos, they've fallen upon each other. A dispute over a water right. They've slaughtered each other's armies in a valley. There is no one left to lead. No one." The potter's words were the final, brutal chapter of the story Leander had been piecing together. It was a chain reaction of self-immolation. Mycenae's internal strife had been the signal for every petty grievance, every long simmering rivalry between the citadels, to erupt into open warfare. The intricate web of alliances that had defined the Mycenaean world was now a net in which they were all strangling each other. There was no central authority left to call for peace, no Wanax whose word could command the warring lords to stand down. The civilization was not being invaded. It was committing suicide in a dozen different places at once. They shared their meager food and water with the potter, who, after his tears were spent, fell into an exhausted sleep. Leander looked at Lytias and saw his own despair reflected in the younger man's face. Their flight, their loyalty, had been for nothing. They had saved a king, but the kingdom was already a corpse. "What do we do, Captain?" Lytias asked, his voice hollow. Leander gazed out at the harsh, beautiful landscape. The gray-green olives on the hills, the stark cliffs, the endless blue sky. This land would remain. The people would remain, though they would be fewer, poorer, and haunted. The great palaces would be abandoned, their linear B-script forgotten, their stories crumbling into legend. "We survive," Leander said, the words tasting like ash. "Not as soldiers of a king or captains of a guard, but as men. We protect those we can. We remember what we can. And we wait." "Wait for what?" Leander shook his head, his eyes on the distant smoke-stained horizon. "I do not know. For the fires to burn out, for the earth to heal, for a day when the stories of the great kings of Mycenae are told not as history, but as myths around a campfire, by people who have forgotten how to build in stone." He turned his back on the view, on the dying world, and walked back into the darkness of the cave to sit beside the silent king. The war was over. There were no victors. There was only the long, slow, quiet descent into a darkness that would last for centuries. An age so deep and profound that the memory of the men who had built the Lion Gate would become nothing more than a ghost story, a whisper on the wind.